Hi everyone, it's Jess here from the Writer's Block, and today I'm going to be talking about poetry. There is a lot in this PowerPoint, so don't worry if you don't understand any of it. It might take a couple of watches, but that is fine. Um, it is quite complicated, but once you sort of get used to it, you kind of understand the terminology. It's going to be a lot easier. So first of all, I want to start a little bit with what poetry actually kind of has been through in the past. So I'm going to start first of all with Enlightenment. I'm not going to go back to the ancient times because that's just going to take forever. But I'm going to start with the Enlightenment, where there was an emphasis on science, reason, that kind of thing, and there was a lot of thinking about philosophy and that kind of thing, and that was kind of integrated into poetry. And then not long after that, people were starting to realise that there are maybe things that are more important than reason and science and stuff like that, which is where the Romantic period comes in. And that's romantic with a capital R, so not romantic with a little r, because it doesn't mean literally romance and love and that kind of thing. It's just really general feelings, so intense feelings. And a lot of the time also there's emphasis on nature. And there's also this thing called the sublime. So the sublime is really just feeling like something is so much bigger than you that you're a bit overwhelmed. Usually nature. You can see paintings that depict that, but we're talking about poetry. So we also have, after that, I've probably skipped a couple of decades, but after that we have the modernist period, which is where things start to get a little bit less conventional, a little bit less chronological. Poets stop kind of putting narratives into their work. It's less of a story, and it's more of a celebration of themselves, the self, that kind of thing. And you can definitely see that in some of the poetry that I'm going to show you. And kind of offshoots of this was confessional. So confessional poetry was always about the self, really. You can tell confessional as a word means, confession. And that sort of encapsulates things like Sylvia Plath and Sexton, Robert Lowell. And that is all kind of, I'm going to assume, probably where we're going to end up going with our poetry once we finish this video. Because that is generally what today's poetry is. But some of this is also beat poets. Some modernist poetry is also beat poets, which kind of is personal, but it can be political as well. We're thinking people like Jack Kerouac, we're thinking people like Allen Ginsberg, mostly American, not always, but mostly American. And that is the kind of, if you want to have a crossover between personal and political, that's really the stuff to study. We also then move into our postmodernist era. So this is kind of the last one, because there is a debate about whether or not we actually are still in the postmodernist era. A lot of people think we're not, a lot of people think we are. It depends on your opinion. But the thing that people do agree on about postmodernism is that it's a lot more disorganised. Things get even more kind of unconventional. And then you think of people who are kind of on social media these days, and we can kind of class them as postmodernist in a way. Because if you think about people like Rupi Kaur, and Charlie Cox, I suppose, as well, people like that, they use Instagram to put their poetry out there. And they're called Insta poets, which, massive difference to the Enlightenment poets. And a lot of the time they're also called feminist poets, which kind of is less conventional, of course, because way back when, mostly it was men writing poetry. And now it's more of a female thing, it seems to be anyway. But, there is obviously no gender to poetry. It just is seemingly the direction it is taking at this point in time. So, would be good to balance the scales a little bit. I'm going through this and I just want to look at a couple of these contemporary poets just to kind of get our brains working. So all of these are written in free verse. From left to right we have Ocean Vuong, we have Caroline Duffy, who was recently Poet Laureate, so very prestigious. And on the right we have Dakota Warren, who is very up and coming. And I wouldn't call her a feminist poet, but she definitely is kind of on the cusp of being one. But I think it's quite interesting to see how she uses her presence on social media to, make her work very, out there. But what actually is poetry? So, the Oxford English Dictionary actually defines it as, a literary work in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Not always rhythm. You can see, obviously, distinctive style is very much a thing there. But I think something that the Romantic poetry, Victorian movement does, is it does take that idea of expression of feelings and it really elevates it. And I think that's a lot of where this definition probably comes from. There is obviously not so much focus on metre, but at this point, we've also got other people who say things about poetry. And, these are all poets. So we have Coleridge, who is a Romantic poet. He says poetry is the best words in the best order. Fair enough, a bit biased, but and we've also got W.H. Auden, who is a confessional poet, who says the simplest is still the best, memorable speech. But that's kind of interesting for him since he's quite confessional. Sherman Alexie says anger X the imagination. That feels like quite a confessional definition. And then we have another Romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who says poetry is a mirror. So it kind of holds a mirror up to the world and says, this is what's wrong with you. Or it can do the opposite and say, this is what's beautiful, that which is distorted, So quite interesting ideas there, but this is not helpful if we don't kind of look at other stuff as well. So firstly, I'm going to look at metre and rhythm. So the first thing to remember with feet in poetry is that it is complicated and you're never going to remember it the first time you encounter it because it's really complicated. But essentially, a foot is a unit of metre, and that's not like metre as in the measurement, it's metre as in rhythm. So it determines rhythm because it determines which syllables, and syllables is just a unit of sound if you don't know. So, poetry has 3, unit has 2, as just demonstrated there. So it determines which syllables are stressed and which are unstressed, pretty much. So it will always have either 2 or 3 syllables, in one foot. So, for example, I am is 2 syllables. 2 syllables makes a foot. This is really complicated, I understand that, but I will give you examples, and if you want to pause the video, there are other examples there as well. But the reason I'm just saying iamb is because that's the example we're going to give, and that is the most common. And the reason it's the most common is because it is, associated with everyday speech. It is the most natural. So iambic means that the lines are going to be stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. Alternatively, that can be, long, short, long, short. That's kind of how it used to be defined. But each foot, like I said, is a cycle of stressed and unstressed. But iambic pentameter sounds a bit complicated if you don't know what the hell that means. But pentameter, pent means 5. So pentameter determines how many syllables are actually in a line. And because pent means 5, we've got 5 feet, and 2 syllables make a foot. We've got, there are 10 syllables in each line. And then we have, at the very end, iambic pentameter without rhyme is often called blank verse. So here is an example of this in action. So this is an example from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, and this is where Beatrice realises that Benedict might love her. It's in blank verse, and we can see I've separated the first line out and put the stressed syllables in bold. So, what fire is in mine ears, can this be true, is the general rhythm. Very monosyllabic, so only 1 syllable per word, which is quite interesting. And then it kind of changes. So the presentation of the iambic pentameter kind of is a little bit different as the text goes through. But really, this is just a simple example of it. It's quite a plain example of it. Stand I, condemned for pride and scorn so much. You could actually argue potentially that it's not iambic pentameter and that it's some other, foot, potentially some type of foot, but I'm pretty sure it's iambic pentameter. Anyway, here are some of the other feet. So I teach a couple of different poems, and I think with Charge of the Light Brigade, which is where Road the 600 is from, dactylic diameter is pretty much throughout. So we've got Road the 600. 100 is the short syllable there, and I think that is sort of mimicking potentially how the flight down the Valley of Death kind of lasted forever, or it felt like it did anyway. So now I'm going to be looking at types of rhyme. There are so many different types, probably more than you realise. And actually doing my research for this, I found that there were way more than I thought there were as well. So that was interesting. So here are what I think are the most common. So we've got rhyming couplets, we've got enclosed rhyme, and we've got alternate rhyme. So these are generally the most used in poetry, I would say. Not that the others aren't used, because they 100% are, but I think these are the ones that you're likely to be the most familiar with. So rhyming couplets are essentially just the rhymes that are next to each other. They succeed each other. So we've got bright and night on 2 successive lines, and then ear and dear being the same. Enclosed rhyme, slightly different. So sun and lion, technically they're not actually rhymes. I mean, they are half rhymes, so we'll get to that in a second. Sun and lion, let's just say they're a rhyme for now, and we've got strut and nut as well. One of the rhyme pairs is enclosed within the other one, and that's why it's called that. Alternate rhyme is exactly what it sounds like, so it's alternating. So we've got desire and pure, technically again a half rhyme, but we will go into that in a second. Height and light, so we've got AB, AB, so alternating. These are all types of end rhymes, and they can all be used for different purposes. Sometimes you might just like the sound of a rhyme, but sometimes they can suggest or mimic different things. So when I use rhyming couplets, I rarely do, because I don't really write things that are quite cohesive, but I like to use them for things like love poems, because it kind of gives this idea of like cohesion, two lovers, you know, inseparableness, basically. Alternate rhyme is kind of similar. In a positive sense, it can represent a breaking free from convention. Enclosed rhyme is more negative most of the time, so it can represent entrapment or monotony. So this poem that this is actually taken from, the apes yawning as all their fleas in the sun, you can really see that this is about a zoo, and more specifically it's about a jaguar. This poem is by Ted Hughes, and the whole poem pretty much is about the jaguar being enclosed in a cage, and I think that's a quite interesting way of kind of mirroring that. So here are the other types of rhyme. They are still end rhymes a lot of the time, but we have masculine rhyme and feminine rhyme, and what the hell does that mean? Well, masculine rhyme, only one syllable rhymes. So we've got examples here. We've got fen, pen, men, again, and on the other side we've this rhyme consists of more than one syllable. So with feminine rhyme, this one is kind of debatable, but hour, I would pronounce that with 2 syllables. Hour, bower, dower, power. This poem is by William Wordsworth, by the way, who you should definitely check out because I love him so much. But going on a tangent, you see the kind of effect of mixing up those different syllable counted rhymes. It gives a bit of variation, makes it a bit more interesting. The sound is different, and yeah, makes it a bit more potentially chaotic if you want that effect. It depends on what you're looking for though. So the musical fans are going to love me with this one. So this is internal rhyme versus end rhyme. We've been through end rhyme already. This one is internal rhyme. This example does have end rhymes, and all the Hamilton fans are going to love me for this. I'm a Hamilton fan as well. This is from a song called We Know. And it has lots of internal rhymes. When I thought of an example for internal rhyme, this was the first thing that came up in my head, because there are so many examples of it. There are lots of examples actually in Hamilton just in general, but this is the thing that came up in my head most of all. So you can see, this is a rap actually. I'm not going to sit here and rap it, I'm going to talk it. But you can see when you talk it, what the effect is. So she courted me, escorted me to, and when she had me in a corner, that's when Reynolds extorted me. Already you can see the internal rhyme there kind of creating this rhythm. Even though there's no real meter to it and there's no real actual rhythm through syllables, there are definitely rhythms created through rhymes. For a sordid fee, I paid him quarterly. I may have mortally wounded my prospects, but my papers are orderly. And again, rhythm created there. As you can see, I kept a record of every check in my checkered history. Check it against your list and see consistency. I never spent a cent that wasn't mine. You sent the dogs after my scent. That's fine. Yes, I have reasons for shame, but I have not committed treason and sullied my good name. You can really see the rhythm coming out there. As you can see, I've done nothing to provoke legal action. Are my answers to your satisfaction? So yeah, rhymes in the middle of a line versus rhymes at the end of a line. You can really see what the difference is. And actually, if it was down to me, I think I 100% prefer internal rhymes because I think they are, in a way, cleverer and they sound less forced. Okay, and then we have half rhymes and slant rhymes as well. So these are rhymes that don't quite qualify as a rhyme, but are still very similar. So nivus and nervous, silent and salient, brambles and rumbles, things like that. I love this poem. This is Exposure by Wilfred Owen. I think it is so clever. And these kinds of rhyme pretty much can express chaos. They can express kind of not really knowing what's going to happen. We've kind of got that here, but nothing happens. And that tone of uncertainty with the question mark, what are we doing here? It very much kind of depicts this disorder. Lastly, with rhymes, we have I rhymes. So these are strange rhymes. These don't always sound the same. They don't always actually rhyme. This is rhymes that are spelled the same. So things like song and long or hear and ear, but it also can be things like height and weight and rough and cough and comb and tomb and bomb. Obviously, they don't rhyme. They don't sound the same, but they are I rhymes because they look the same. And often that can give this idea of kind of like a false sense of security, false sense of order. So next up we have forms, and there are so many different forms. There's like a million different forms, so this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but this is pretty much the main ones that I could think of anyway. So this is a haiku, and we've also got a limerick here. Both of these authors, or poets I suppose, are awesome. The syllable numbers on the side are syllables. So we've got in the first line for the haiku 5, and then the middle one 7, and then the last one 5 again. And that is standard for all haikus. With limericks, it's slightly different. So it's not standard that it's 99559. The second and last can be 7 to 9, and the third and fourth can be 5 to 7 syllables. So it does have a bit of variation. It's not as strict as the haiku, but it definitely still is kind of strict. Another strict feature of the limerick is that we have AABBA rhyme scheme, so it has to be that, otherwise it's not a limerick. And generally as well, not always, but generally, the tone of the limerick is a lot more amusing. It's a lot more light-hearted. You can see that in this one. There was a young lady of Norway who hung by her toes in a doorway. She said to her beau, "Just look at me, Joe. I think I've discovered one more way." So this is very typical of Swinburne. He is, if you know, you know, is all I'm going to say. But he is really, really talented. He's fantastic. He is quite, he's not very contemporary though. He's like Victorian, maybe even longer ago. I'm not 100% sure, but he's very good if you're into kind of exploring queer writing and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm going on a tangent. So these are the short ones that I'm going to go through, and the others are a little bit longer, so brace yourself. So if you know anything about poetry, especially sonnets, then you're going to know this famous sonnet. It's very famous. This line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," is really famous. And all the way through, we've got ABAB quatrains, and within the sonnet, until the couplet at the end. So the couplet at the end kind of has that sense of finality that I talked about, in terms of its inseparableness. So C and D, they come together as a pair. We've got the same sort of typical love poetryness, and sonnets typically are love poetry. Some people have experimented with that recently, and it's really interesting to see it. But a sonnet, generally, there are two different types of sonnet. There is a Petrarchan sonnet and there is a Shakespearean sonnet. But a sonnet, all sonnets have one thing in common, and that is that they are iambic pentameter. They are 14 lines, and usually there is a volta in them. So a volta is just a turn in the tone or the mood or something like that. Usually, not always. The Petrarchan sonnet is slightly different, because instead of the ABAB, we have the octave at the beginning, which is 8 lines. We have ABBA, ABBA. This sounds really confusing, I know. And then we have the sestet, which is 6 lines, and that is CDE, CDE, or it can be CD, CD, CD. It does depend on what style you're looking for. It's, whatever you want to do with your sort of artistry. But they all have one thing in common, and that is, again, that they are 14 lines and iambic pentameter. This one also has a volta at line 9. You can stop and read it if you want to. I'm not going to. But this specifically is a very good example, because it is pretty much the typical nature of Petrarchan sonnets. Next, I'm going into the villanelle, which is a French form of verse, and it is always 19 lines, and that is always tercets. So tercets are 3 lines, 3-line stanzas, and then at the end we have our quatrain. So it's 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, pretty much, which makes it obviously 19 lines. And this is one of my favourite poems by Dylan Thomas. It's called "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night." It's very famous, you might have heard of it. And especially the last couple of lines, I think, are very very resonating, very famous. So do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Of course, we have that rhyming couplet there again, so that's very, very present all the time. But there is no solid meter rule in villanelles. It's almost free verse, and this one specifically is iambic pentameter, but they don't have to be. Which I think I'm really glad they did it like this, because it is absolutely beautiful, and it really does kind of set up that inevitability quite well of, you know, going into the dying of the light. And this is where we start to get a little bit less strict in our meter and our rhyme scheme, and it's a little bit more determined by intention. So odes, this one, they aim to celebrate something. So this is Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode to a Nightingale is a really beautiful poem. I think it's so well thought out, and you can see that the stanzas are kind of all different in their shape, and there's no real rhyme or reason, no pun intended, to what's going on here. But it basically just celebrates how beautiful a nightingale is, and that's why I put this picture up here, because it's just beautiful. We've got beautiful words like drowsy numbness. I mean, that kind of has the softness to it that beauty looks for generally. And Keats is the author of this poem. Keats was very much, I'm going on a tangent now, but Keats was very much about beauty and poetry, and he was kind of like, poetry isn't poetry if it's not beautiful. But, you know, light-winged, melodious, that kind of, it's just softness, and I think that is really what the ode's all about. It aims to celebrate, especially celebrating beauty of something. Really, I think it's a beautiful poem. Obviously, this isn't the full poem, and you can go and check it out if you want to. Similarly, elegies are determined as elegies from their intention. So this, you know, they're usually about someone who's died, so or just something that's died in general. This one is about W.B. Yeats, written by W.H. Auden. Both of them were confessional poets, I'm pretty sure, I'll have to double check that, but both of them were confessional poets. Both of them are kind of around the style you're probably looking at if you're looking to write poetry. It depends what you're looking for, but generally I would say that most of you probably are looking at confessional poetry or something very similar. So an elegy, of course, usually expresses sadness over someone who's died or something that's died. And this one's really sad. You can see immediately as we go into it, the opening, he disappeared in the dead of winter. And this isn't the full poem, but all the way through, it's got this tone of melancholy to it. And I think that's something that always goes right through elegies. On a happier note, here we have ballads. So ballads are usually quite lyrical and song-like, and traditionally they're spoken, and sometimes they've been passed down through generations, sometimes like epics, which I'll get to in a minute, but often they're celebratory. This one especially is a celebratory poem, and this one is a really good example of a ballad because it has that kind of rhythm to it. We've got half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. And I won't read loads and loads of it, and this isn't the full poem, it goes on forever. But Alfred Lord Tennyson, he was essentially writing about, I mean, the Charge of the Light Brigade, but the Charge of the Light Brigade basically just celebrates the bravery of some people who went into war knowing that they were going to die, like there was no way they were going to come out of it alive, because somebody had made a blunder. You know, you see there in the second stanza, someone had blundered. So that repetition, there is not to make reply, there's not a reason why, kind of emphasises that lyricality, I don't know what the word is, but you know what I mean. So we've got this song-like nature to the poem, and that emphasises the celebratory nature, which, you know, I think is beautiful. I don't think he should have written this poem like this. I think he should have sort of mourned rather than celebrated the fact that they died, but, you know, moving on. So here we have epics, the famous epic. So this is usually book length. Epics are usually book length, and obviously, for that reason, the full poem is definitely not here. This one's Paradise Lost. I've got a tiny little copy of it. You can find it online if you want to look at it, but it is really, really long, and it's quite difficult language too. Most of them are difficult language because they were written a very long time ago, and that leads me into kind of talking about things like the Odyssey. The obvious choice to put here would have been the Odyssey, but interestingly I couldn't find a verse version of it because it's kind of been converted to prose over the years, which is really weird. But we've also got things like the Aeneid by Virgil, which I love, I think it's great, and we've also got the Prelude. I love William Wordsworth, he is amazing. If you're looking at reading one, getting into poetry, the Prelude is probably the one I'd suggest, just because the language is so much easier. But that if you're thinking of writing an epic, good luck to you. But also, prelude is a really good one to look at as an example, because it kind of has somewhat modern language. So yeah, and this is pentameter. At least I'm pretty sure it is. I know that the prelude definitely is. But I'm a pentameter to do that for 250 pages worth. I mean, whoa, you've got to be talented. But yeah, it's usually a godlike hero on a mission. They've been set on a journey or something like that. Not always. So the prelude doesn't really do that. You could argue it does, but it depends. So if you're looking to do an epic, and maybe break outside the boundaries, break outside the conventions of an epic, but still within the form of an epic, you might just be making history. So, just saying. So, this one is free verse. Everyone in the staff has heard me talk about Sylvia Plath before. Everyone as well, probably in the staff, has heard me talk about Sylvia Plath because I did my thesis on her, and I think she is fantastic. Sometimes she has moments where she's not so great, but we're not going to talk about that. This is free verse. She uses rhyme to her advantage, but she doesn't use it in a set way. It's kind of unpredictable, which kind of mimics how she's feeling, I think. And this one is called Daddy. So you do not do any more black shoe, in which I've lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or at you. So weird one, definitely a weird poem. But it has no rhythm to it, really. It kind of has this fairy tale-ish quality to it, but it doesn't have a rigid meter. So it's kind of leaving space for something unpredictable to happen, especially with that dash there in the second stanza. You can really see that kind of thing. So basically, free verse is just doing away with meter and doing what the hell you want to do. So as long as it's for effect, you're good. Because I think that you will probably be aiming for free verse most of the time, I'm going to give two examples. So this is an example that you might be more familiar with. This is Ruby Carr, and she says, "I am water soft enough to offer life, tough enough to drown it away," which, simple as that. Simple as that. She is an Insta poet alongside Amanda Lovelace and Charlie Cox. Like I said before, you know, free verse has in the past kind of been seen as a little bit not as prestigious as Misa and that kind of thing, but recent poets like Duffy and Simon Armitage have definitely taken that up as a choice, and they've been really highly regarded for it, so definitely one to think about. Lastly, I'm going to move into a couple of punctuation technicalities in poetry, which there's no right answer, but I'm going to show you a couple of things that you can do with them just to set you off in the right direction. So, caesura, essentially, it sounds really complicated when it's not at all. It basically just means that there's like punctuation in the middle of a line. So we've got that question mark in the first bit, we've got those commas in the second and third. And what that does usually is it makes you stop and think about what you've just read. So, how do I love thee? And then there's a pause. So what that does is it emphasises what's happening. It makes you stop and pause, and just, you know, like I said, think. We also have end stop. So what that does is gives a sense of finality because it's a full stop on the end of a line. I say full stop, I'm British. Period on the end of a line. And that gives a sense of finality. It's a little bit like a rhyming couplet in that sense. And then lastly, we have enjambment. Some people call it enchantment or enjambment if you're French, because it is a French term. But basically, that's the opposite of end stop. There's no punctuation on the end of a line. And what that does is it gives it kind of flow. Lots of people use it when they're talking about things like water, because, of course, flow. Lots of people will talk about it when they're thinking about time going too fast, flow of time, that kind of thing. But really, there is no set way to do it. I mean, you can't have a line without one of these two in it, pretty much. So whatever you want to do, it's a creative process. There's no right answer to it. These are all just ideas. So that's me. I have been Jess from the Writer's Block. I hope this has been helpful. And yeah, poetry is something I love so much, so if you have any questions in the server or anything, you know, don't hesitate to ask. I write poetry myself, so if you want to have a look at that as well, don't hesitate to ask. Okay, I will end it here. I will see you in the server.